We continue in this series entitled, This Is Our Story. If you're here with us for the first time, we're in the middle of a series that's a vision casting series for where we've come from, where we are, where we're headed. And the idea of This Is My Story sort of tags back to, for those of you like me who grew up in church, the reminder of sort of the chorus of that song, This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long, as this series began with my story to some degree. And then it transitions into essentially who we are, who we're becoming. And so today we're in kind of that section covering essentially the understanding of what it means to be and what we refer to as an apprentice of Jesus. The Bible uses the language of disciple of Jesus. And apprentice we use because it's perhaps understood a little bit better in our day than the word disciple. And so this is the goal for us, is to become apprentices of Jesus, and then to understand what that means, to engage and give our lives to that as it shapes not only who we are becoming individually. My hope is the title of this series will become sort of your title for your life too, that this is your story. The intentional desire and commitment to become or to continue to be and grow as an apprentice of Jesus. And so we want to walk through what that looks like, what we talk about, what we mean when we talk about that. And so last week I entered into sort of a 3-section sermon talking about the 3 goals that in Jesus' day, the disciples understood that there was this commitment, this sort of 3-stage or series or sort of well-rounded sense of commitment, what it meant to be then a follower of Jesus, an apprentice of Jesus, using that language similarly. And so last week I talked about the first stage of that is to be with Jesus, to be with, in that day, be with your rabbi, whoever it was. But for our sakes, to be with Jesus. Today I want to talk about the second one, which is to become like Jesus. There you go. I'm trying to feed you the answer. And then the third one of that is, just to not put you under pressure, is to do what he did. That was the goal of every disciple of Jesus in his day. It's the goal of what he wants for us now, to understand that to say, I'm a follower of Jesus, which can be considered or understood differently than the word Christian. And so that's why we're using it. To be a follower of Jesus meant to, I've committed my life to sort of 3 goals: to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and then to do what Jesus did. And so I want to unpack the second one today as we move forward into this. As Jesus invites us then to become his apprentices, there was this whole system that I talked about last week. And so to be an apprentice of Jesus meant that. And I guess I could have given you those slides so you can see it and follow along with me, not just hold you to memory. It was understood in those days. And so let me start with a passage in Luke where Jesus talks about then this idea of what it means to be with him, at least throws it out there. In Luke chapter 6, Luke writes this. He also told him this parable, and this is the smallest parable you can find, I think, in the scriptures. This was the whole thing. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. So there's a couple of things to point out about that. This is, again, about training to be a follower of Christ, training to be disciples, understanding what it means to be disciples. And so there's this reference then to blind leading the blind, and if you're sort of reading and remembering how Jesus talks about it, it's sort of a nod or a reference to the Pharisees, who he at times calls the blind. He's saying, so the blind lead the blind those who adhere only to the law and miss the heart of what the kingdom is about, that it's deeper than that. Can the blind lead the blind? Won't they both fall into a pit? Well, the answer which, well, yeah, that probably is the case. So we refer to them as blind guides. And then he says, can the student or the disciple, the apprentice, is not above the teacher. So he's classifying again. So there's a sense in which that you're learning from me, being with me, and to become like me, you need to be with me and learn from me. And then he says, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. In other words, there's this process of training. The expectation that you don't just sort of hang out with Jesus long enough that you'll get it, or you show up to church often enough that you're going to get this, that it's this intentional sense of the point of apprenticeship is to become like the rabbi, not just to have his knowledge, but to be transformed by the experience, by what you learn being with Jesus in training to become like Jesus. It takes training. It doesn't just happen. And he says there's those who are fully trained, which means there's stages of training. Implies that there's essentially the partially trained, the sort of first ones in, partially trained, that there's this growth that should happen along the way. And so what does that mean for you and for me? That it means that if you're an apprentice of Jesus, again, meaning that you've deliberately chosen to order your life around these three goals: to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, in order to, in time, do what Jesus did. In some ways, that's a stage of progression. In other ways, it's like this is the thing we're always doing. You don't get past being with Jesus, but it starts there because this is a relationship. Maybe we'd say it this way: to seek to become like Jesus is to acknowledge that he was and is the ultimate model and master of the good life. The experience of being fully human as God intended and designed us to be at creation. I mean, that's the acknowledgement we're making. It's the acknowledgement they made. That he was the rabbi. I mean, the role of the rabbi in that day, all rabbis, was to be wisdom teachers. In other words, that's what they're known for. And to be wisdom teachers is to say, this is the way to live the wisest life. Another way of saying that is, this is the way of living in alignment with what is real. The reality of how the world works. In every arena and every space of your life, there's a way the world works, and to live in line with the way God designed the world to work is to live wisely, is to live then the good life, the eternal life. And so Jesus comes teaching his yoke, in other words, his interpretation of what it means to live the good life. So in following him, we're essentially saying we believe and trust that you understand and live that, have modeled that for us like no other human being ever has. What it means to be literally fully human. Jesus' framework or his language is often the language of life in the kingdom of God, but that's what he's talking about. He's never talking about the life you experience somewhere out there floating on a cloud after you die. He's always talking about finding that life here, what it means to be fully human. What set Jesus apart from all other rabbis and teachers of the law was his understanding, again, his yoke, of what it would take to become the kind of person who could and would be able to experience that life. It's what set him apart. And again, he then modeled it. The Sermon on the Mount, in fact, is Jesus' most significant collection of teachings to teach us this is what it looks like to live this, to live into and experience a fully human life, the good life, the abundant life, the eternal life, the life God designed all human beings to live, that Jesus models for us, and it reflects his own. And we found out again last week that up to this point, or earlier in the series anyway, up to this point, the understanding was that those who kept the law, the Pharisees and the scribes, were the models, were the ones who were considered righteous. And they were. They followed the laws. It was their job, essentially, to keep the law better than anybody else, to keep all the laws. And they did a really good job with that. In their understanding, then, goodness or right living meant fulfillment of the law. In other words, good people keep the law. They don't sin. They don't break the law. They're righteous in God's eyes. They have God's favor. And to that point, that's how all of Israel understood it. It wasn't a wrong thing. It was the stage at which God had met them. Jesus comes along to say, well, you've heard it said, but there's this next layer. There's really a sense in which the law is a good beginning point. It's training wheels for the life that you're searching out for. It's a way of understanding I've got some growth to do, but it will never get you to that point. And so if you're hearing Jesus say that, and you're not a Pharisee or a scribe, a teacher of the law, if you would, where does that leave you if that's the righteous life? Where does it leave everyone else, the unrighteous or the sinners? It leaves you in a position of saying, I just got to try harder to try and become like them. But Jesus comes along in the Sermon on the Mount and drops this paradigm-shifting bomb. His interpretation, his new yoke for what reality is, about what it means to live the good life. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus says this: For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the scribes, some translations say, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, in my growing up years, what I understood that, in some ways taught to understand what that means, is essentially to not enter the kingdom of heaven means that you're not going to go to heaven when you die. Jesus is never saying that, just to clarify. He's saying that life of the kingdom, again, the good life, is available here in him. That's his invitation to all, come and follow me, is an invitation to experience that life here and now. What he's saying is, essentially, if you're leaning on the law, if you're expecting the law to get you, it's not going to get there. You have to surpass that. You have to exceed that. It will get you so far, but you won't enter the fullness of the life that I've come to offer. That's what he's telling us. It has to transcend that. So the question in their minds is, how do you do better than just keeping the law? I mean, if it's more than keeping the law, how do we do better? And Jesus is essentially saying this: you don't aim higher. It's not sort of you got to do better more often. You don't just be good, be better, do more. That's focusing on behavior, the things that are on the external side of man. He says you have to go deeper. It's deeper. You aim deeper to become not just somebody who does good, is the language we use around here, to become the kind of person through whom goodness naturally flows. Through whom goodness naturally flows. It's you grow into, you eventually in time, through the training into the example and becoming like Jesus, begin to have this transformation from the inside out that changes your want to, and ultimately grows into the kind of person who doesn't just do good, they just naturally do it. It just naturally flows through them. They're not second guessing, they're not trying just to do that. It begins to just come out of who they are. It's called character. Their character begins to shape into someone who just naturally does what is good. And so following that verse, Jesus goes into then this sort of 4 or 5 displays or examples of what that looks like then in human life, what that means. And so he talks about then first this thing called anger. And he says sort of his verse talks about anyone who murders somebody is going to be subject to the law. And so that's a good thing, that's the law. But he says, I'm telling you that if you're angry at a brother, angry at someone else, and he used this word, so if you call your brother, if you use this language of your brother, racha is the word, like a fool, it doesn't have the impact. It's essentially this language of condemnation of them. This language that is essentially not just anger, but contemptuous anger. He's saying, I'm saying to you, you've heard it said that if if you murder someone, you'll be subject to law. I'm telling you, if you speak to another brother, wish in your heart this kind of anger that uses language that's dehumanizing to them, you are also guilty of murder. He raises the bar from the outside to the inside. He's illustrating in this example and those that follow what we might think of as the universal character defects. Ways in which we engage the world that by our own nature we move into. All of us have anger. There's anger that is righteous, that is good. It's a God-given emotion. But there's anger that easily moves beyond its healthy good function to an anger that's vengeful, an anger that's hateful, an anger that's contemptuous of others. And Jesus is warning us. This is an easy, natural way to go, but it's taking you to a different place. He's saying a good person essentially doesn't commit murder, right? Agreed? But most would also agree that someone who does intentionally murder another is not a good person. What Jesus is saying is this: one who has contempt for another, in other words, anger that is festered into a dehumanizing view or attitude or language towards the other, is also guilty of murder. Not physical murder. Why? Here's the reason why. Because they both want the same thing: the elimination of the humanity of that person. Physically, or if nothing else, spiritually. Like, I wish you were dead. In other words, they're the kind of person who, if they knew they could physically kill them and get away with it, they most likely would. They just know that there's a law against it, and they don't want to face the law. So he's making this comparison, not in terms of what you do on the outside, but saying, what kind of person are you on the inside? If you're the kind of person who has that kind of anger and wishes that on someone else, uses your language to dehumanize them in some way, you're already in the same place spiritually. You're murdering their humanity. You are wishing that dead. The first one is a way that acts, which it violates the law. The other one is one who, again, if there were a law against it, weren't a law against it, they would do it. They might do it. It's the same, essentially, condition of the heart, of the will. Here's the point. Jesus' aim is the transformation of the heart, which is the will. Same thing. Biblical language, New Testament language, spirit, heart is always a reference to the will. So that we're not just people who do good, keeping the law, not murdering physically, but that we become people through whom goodness naturally flows, that we're evaluating, reflecting on, do I have a heart that if it were up to me and nobody would know, or there weren't a law against it, that I would literally murder that person? Am I murdering them with my words? Am I murdering them in my heart? That I want them to feel at least pain. I want them to hurt. I want them to disappear. I want them to feel less than human. It's a difference between focusing on behavior and developing character. And that's what Jesus is always getting at. To become like Jesus is to do the work to figure out what it means, not just to do good on the outside, but to become the kind of person, to have the kind of character. Because character is just that. Character is what you do naturally. It's just what happens as you move through the world, is your character. It's the difference between focusing on behavior and the intentional choice to develop character. So to seek to become like Jesus is to aim at that. To become the kind of person for whom it's harder, to flip this around, to curse those who curse you than it is to bless them. Your first instinct to someone who's angry and shouting at you is to bless them, is to want to calm them rather than shout back. The kind of person who it's harder to retaliate when you've been wronged than to forgive. That your natural impulse is to forgive when being wronged, as opposed to the natural impulse to say, I'm going to bear up, get my side of the argument built up, and fight you back. The kind of person who's harder to treat someone as their means to your goal, to use them to boost your image, your profit, your influence, than to work for their good, to work for what's good for them, even at some cost to you if necessary. Because that's no longer your nature. That's what he's talking about. That's the goal. That's what it means. So naturally, to become like Jesus will require a radical overhaul of our entire person from the inside out. And that's what Jesus is referencing in this passage. It requires an overhaul. The word used in Scripture is the word transformation. 2 Corinthians 3:18, Paul writes, and we all, with unveiled face, continually seeing as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, speaking of Jesus, are progressively being transformed into his image from one degree of glory to even more glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. See, Paul gets this as well. I mean, Paul's a master student of Jesus. He's a brilliant man. He's understanding. For change to happen, it has to happen from the inside out. It's a transformation. The Greek word is the word tied to the word we use of metamorphosis. That there's this change that has to happen that changes the nature from the inside out of this being. So it was this way and now it's this way. It's not just somebody who does good on the outside. It's somebody who from the inside out has now learned to do, through whom to do good naturally. It's just their way of being. The word metamorphosis, according to Webster, is this. It's a profound change in form from one stage to the next in life history of an organism, as from the caterpillar to the pupa, and from the pupa to the adult butterfly. The illustration of what Jesus is talking about, what Paul is talking about. When we're talking about transformation, that's the language they're using. It's the same word. The stages that happen. It doesn't happen with the decision to trust Jesus. It doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't happen in a week. It doesn't happen in 5 years. It happens over a lifetime of walking in step with Jesus, of being with Jesus, of pursuing a life to become like Jesus. So it raises the question, is this kind of change even possible? Well, you have to think on that for a minute and seriously consider it, because it's church, so the answer generally is like, yeah. But think about what that involves, the weight of that, to seriously consider what it looks like, what it means to intentionally take steps to model my life after Jesus. Not just to model it, but to, in time, become like Jesus. In other words, you have to really believe, trust, expect that you can become like Jesus. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but think about that one. Anybody there? Like fully trust that you can become like Jesus? I mean, I grew up been in church my whole life, and I would have to say the overarching message I received, if I'm not singling out one conversation, is nobody gets there. I mean, you can get better, you can become a bit more like him, but to become like Jesus, he's Jesus. And there's some truth to that. I don't want to minimize who Jesus is. I don't want to minimize Jesus' humanity or his deity. But it's the goal, and it's the expectation Jesus has for us. Jesus himself has that expectation. As a rabbi, do we really believe that we can? I heard the joke one time, imagine just being Jesus in Jesus' family. You're one of his brothers. You're James, Jesus' brother, right? And you're playing outside and you're goofing off and you mess up again. And Mary comes along like, James, once again, here you are. Why aren't you more like Jesus? To which James says, Mom, why aren't you more like Jesus? Which is probably what I would say. My growing up, because I had an older brother, and it was always like, why aren't you more like Mark? Why aren't you more like Mark? And I had teachers telling me, why aren't you more like Mark? So at one point, I'm going to give up trying to be like Mark. I'm never going to get there. The reality is Jesus expects and wants to help us get there because he believes we can. In this rabbinic system, the beauty of what Jesus does in inviting anyone who wants to be a disciple was unheard of. As I mentioned last week, to become a disciple of a rabbi, you had to be the best of the best of the best of the very best. The minority, and Jesus comes along and turns that triangle of the best go to the top on its head, saying, anyone who wants to be my disciple must take up their cross and follow me. Believing then, if you want to, what he's saying is, I believe you can do it. You can make a commitment to being with me and we'll do this together. You can make a commitment to grow into becoming like me and you can do it. So at one point, somewhere along the way, you can do what I do. So I think that kind of change is possible. But the next question then would be this. If so, how? And how does that happen? So let's start with the definitions. This is called, the language for that is spiritual formation. It's language as ancient as the church. And the simplest way of understanding that is it's the process of transformation of the whole person from the inside out. Like we talked about the caterpillar. That's what it is. It's spiritual formation. It's not a religious thing just because the word spiritual is in there. It's spirit, again, is your will. It's a change of you from the inside out, your entire person. So let me walk you real quickly through a visual just to show you sort of what we're talking about when we talk about that. To understand what spiritual formation is, you have to understand how we're wired. So spiritual formation involves the transformation of the whole person, beginning at the center. That's what Jesus says, goes to the heart or to the spirit. Begins with the will. Do I want to? Which is why I often say around here, the most important question you can ask somebody is, what do you want? Which is why you see Jesus asking that question. Because I can tell you what to do, but if you don't want to, it won't matter what I say to you. Or if you do it just to keep the law, it won't really matter. What do you want? Do you want to be a good person? Or do you want to be the kind of person through whom goodness just naturally flows? Do you want to be a person who forgives or a person who naturally forgives? It would be harder not to forgive than to forgive. It's how Jesus on the cross, at the end of his life, stretches out his arms. He's dying and says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It's not Jesus being God, having his power. It's Jesus being fully human, saying, understanding that his nature has grown to the place it would be virtually impossible for him not to ask for their forgiveness. He wouldn't even cross his mind. It begins with a will. What do you want? And it's a question for everything that we do in life, not just here in terms of our faith. It's a journey. What do I want? What do I want to eat? Where do I want to go? What job do I want to have? Who do I want to be in a relationship with? Where will I go for vacation? What do you want is always the critical question, because it drives the rest of your life. From that decision, the will of what you want, it engages your mind. You can start thinking about, so what is that going to look like? How do I do that? Which is why Paul tells us, take captive your thoughts. Because words build worlds. And so they matter a lot. From the heart moving out, from the will out, then take capture of mind. Think about what you're saying. Think about what you're doing. Think about what you're asking for. Think about what's going to require. Because you're going to then, from there, move into the world. And so your body becomes this source of strength, your little power pack to move into the world. Shaping and fulfilling the thing it is that you want. And then your social contacts, the relationships that you're in, influence that and matter. So you're thinking about that because they will have an impact on how you do that, what you think about it. And on the outside of that is this language that is unfamiliar to us, is the soul. The soul isn't the thing that goes to heaven when you die. The soul is, think of it sort of, it's a bit nebulous, but the best way to think about it is it's sort of the outer circle of your entire person that encompasses the whole person. And the job of the soul is to keep redirecting the rest of you, the inside of you, to a life with God. To the life that Jesus said is a good life. The job of the soul is to keep trying to align will, heart, body, your social relationship decisions to be in line with reality, to be in line with the kingdom. Does that make sense? Because when it does, when that's working, because you can't manipulate the soul, you can't come into direct contact with the soul. It's a mysterious, I don't have better words to describe it. I don't have better ways to understand it. The function of the soul is that, to keep drawing you to this good life, the understanding of what you were meant to be according to God's design. And so when the rest of that lines up, your soul is at rest. It is well with my soul. Means all of me, regardless of the chaos around me, is at peace. All of it's lined up. From what I want, how I think about that, how I engage that with the ability that I have in my body to move and be in the world, and with the matter of sort of how that implies how I feel about that, and the people that surround me influencing that. It is well with my soul. It means it's aligned. I've got a room to go. But what I do know is that whether the circumstances are chaotic or whether all is going well, it is well with me. I can be at peace. It's Jesus sleeping in the bottom of a boat when there's a storm. I wasn't sleeping Friday night when we had a tornado watch. I was at peace to a degree, but that thought came to mind, this is the kind of thing Jesus would be sleeping, and everybody be going, hey, Jesus, turn on your phone. So this is how we are wired to work. In terms of spiritual formation, that's how it works in a certain way. But let's say this. Spiritual formation isn't a Christian thing. It's a human thing. This is everybody. I mean, those circles are everybody. It's the way we're wired. And Jesus understands that better than anybody. We're all being formed by something or someone. All of us. Whether you know who or what it is or not. We are spiritual creatures that are always being formed in one direction or another. There is no life of non-formation. So maybe we'd say it this way. The question isn't, are you being formed? The question is, who or what is forming you? And that's the real question. Which then raises the critical question, what kind of person are you being formed into? Because we all are. We all are. So I'm going to get to sort of the how we're wired is this. This is how it works then in sort of the sphere of our lives. Here's a diagram to help you understand. I'll try to walk you through it with a little bit of detail, but the next stage of this in a couple of weeks, I'm going to come back and unpack this a little bit more clearly. But just to give you sort of an idea where we're headed. So there's two paradigms for formation. One is unintentional formation, and it looks like this. And then there's intentional formation. I just want to camp on this one today as to wrap up the day. This is how we as human beings are formed. Again, if you think about from the inside out, this is how that works. But this is the outside influence. This is the world in which we live in, how we're wired, how we are formed, whether we know this, understand it, or not. This is the path of unintentional formation. We are all formed by, if you're unintentionally formed, it means that you are being formed by the stories that have made you up. We are story-driven creatures. We can't help it. It's wired into our DNA. We make sense of the world by story. It's the stories that we grew up with, the stories that taught us this is how the world works, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, this is what matters, these are our people, these are those people. Whatever story, whatever value, judgment, conviction, understanding of how the world works you got there by story. Whether it was intentional, whether you picked it up in culture, we are shaped by story. That's how God wired us. You can't get around it. And so we are all, in some way or another, shaped by the stories that are driving us. And so, if you don't know what stories are driving you, they will drive you whether they're helpful or not, whether they're destructive or not. So it's best to do some reflection. What kind of stories are driving? Why do I think this way? Why, when this happens, it upsets me, and not everybody feels that way? Why, when we do this? Why, when I do that? Why do I spend my money this way? Why do I have trouble in this part of my life? What stories are driving that? And you have to go back to, so what is it that I want? What are the thoughts that I have about this? Engage my mind, like why? So what's happening when that happens? Because I don't want that story, I want a different one. How do you start there? What is it that I want? If I don't want that, I want this. What thoughts do I have about it? How am I moving in the world? How am I being in the world with my body, in my relationships? Because in these situations, my soul is not at rest. We're all shaped by stories. We're all shaped by habits. We are habituated creatures. God designed us to be shaped by habits. You got up this morning and you went through a series of things, hundreds of decisions that you didn't have to make because your body knew just what to do. When you woke up, you didn't have to think about, should I open my eyes? You just naturally did it. You don't have to think about, how am I going to get out of bed? Unless you've got, trouble getting around. But if you're in good health, you just popped up, got out of bed. Whatever you did next, you did most likely. You had several habits that were then more intentional, maybe you'd be more aware of. What you eat for breakfast, whether or not you shower, how you do your day. We are habit creatures, creatures of habit by design. And that's a good thing. Because if you had to stop and think about every single decision, like just those two I mentioned, like what should I do? You'd be a mess. I think I'm awake. Oh, open my eyes. It's foolish, but if you thought through your morning to this point, you would see how many hundreds of things you've already done that you didn't even think about because they're just your habit. And that's a good thing. It makes life easier. You're going to get in your car and drive home. You're going to think about, how do I start a car? Like this is a car. How do I get in it? You can talk, you can walk, you can put a key in, open it all at the same time because your body has learned how to do that. And it makes life easier for you. Does that make sense? Habits are a significant part of how we're shaped and formed. And so it can go either way. They can be habits that move us towards a healthier life, or they can be destructive in our life. It goes one way or another. We're all being formed. The stories that drive us influence the habits that are part of our natural life. Think of it this way, in terms of habits. What we do on a regular basis, we become. What we do on a regular basis, we become. Put it this way. The things we do something to us. The things we do something. And again, I'll expand on this in a few weeks. I just want to give you something to be thinking about. The things we do something to us. They shape us. They're forming us. They're driven by the stories that we believe are true, whether they are or not. That moves us into habits that can be helpful or non-helpful, constructive or destructive. They're forming us. Because what we do does something to us. Your habits get into the core of your being by nature, by design, and shape your loves and your longings. You keep a habit, you extend it, it keeps getting easier and easier because you love or like something that you're doing. I love sweets. I know better than to eat all the sweets that I eat. Why do I keep doing it? Because I love it. And I moderate it from time to time. I have good seasons and bad seasons. But it's a natural thing still for me to feel like if there's cookies on the table, somebody's got to have one. Or more. Your habits get into the core of your being and shape your loves and longings. They shape your will. They shape your heart. And the heart is sort of the outward, the orientation and direction forward. The job of the will is to give you an orientation for forward movement in the world. And your habits give it the capacity to do that with greater and greater ease, for better or for worse. What you love, which is particularly shaped by your habits, has far more of an effect on your life than what you know in your head to be true. I know it did. Simple example. I know in my head it's true that it's best that I not eat half a dozen donuts. But it's not beyond me to do that. Again, just a silly illustration. What you know to be right will have a really hard time overriding the combination of the stories and the habits that you have. They call it willpower. Let me just tell you, willpower has no real power. This is where you find it. The willpower is just, what do I want? Be honest about it, and then build habits into your life. Reflect on the stories driving you if you want to change. So we're shaped by the stories that we've grown up with. We're shaped by the habits that are part of our lives, and we're shaped by the relationships that we're part of. All of this is unintentional. It just happens as we do life. In terms of relationships, we become like the people we choose to spend time with on a regular basis. Think about that. You gravitate to certain people because you like them, being around them, and the truth of the matter is, the more you're around them, the more you begin to think like them. Maybe more than that, the more you begin to be like them. So you think about sort of your circle of friends. At some point, it may be natural for you to feel like, I'm going to live in sort of the neighborhood they live in, or the kind of house they live in, or drive the kind of car they drive. They seem to like it. I like driving it. Nothing wrong with that. It's the nature of relationships, that we become like those that we spend time with on a regular basis. We spend time with on a regular basis, generally, unless it's sort of an office worker you don't like, you can't get around it, those we choose to because we like the idea that it's shaping our lives, that we value that. It just happens naturally. Simon's 3.5 years old. Just a week or two ago, it was he and I seated that we were going to play together, in our sunroom. And I said something like, "Hey, I want you to do this." And he looks at me. He goes, "You're not the boss of me." I'm like, "What the heck? I've never heard you say that." So I just kind of chuckled and I said, "Buddy," I said, "I was the boss of your mama when she was your age, and when she's not around, your daddy's not around, I'm the boss of you too." And he just kind of looked at me like, "Oh, what?" So we laughed a bit, and I said, "I think your mama would agree. This isn't good." And so we, joked, talked, and moved on. But it's like, where's he heard that? Well, he didn't hear it, from any of us in the family. Well, he's in preschool now. He has other relationships, right? Somewhere he picked it up. I'm not blaming any kid. I'm just saying it wasn't in our house. But he just, he's with other people and will be like them. I heard that's a good idea. I like that saying. "Papo, you're not the boss of me. I'm going to try that out on you." We become like those who live. Think of your life back in high school, cafeteria, right? There were groups, right? The different groups, and you knew who your people were and who you wanted to be with because we're shaped by relationships. I mean, how do you know what group it is? If you walk into new high school, how do you know what group it is? Well, you learn pretty quick. Whatever those sort of features are, what they drive, where they dress, how they talk, the way they wear their hair, all of the above, I don't know. But you sort of intuitively look for that. And it can be good, it can be bad. It can go either way. Either way, it's forming us. It's forming us. So we're shaped by our stories, by our habits, by our relationships, all in the context of an environment. We live in a world, we live in a culture, we live in a space together that has then some shared understanding of what it is and what it's like to live here. The culture that you live in shapes who you're becoming. When we moved to town in 1993, we're in conversations about sort of this church that we were part of, and sort of this church that adopted sort of this ideal person that they were trying to reach. And the name of that person was sort of the Edwardsville Eddie. And the Edwardsville Eddie, we had these characteristics. In those days, the word was yuppie, sort of these are the features of Edwardsville Eddies. So it was like, this is the town of then. I remember thinking about this and hearing about this again in these conversations that we had. So Edwardsville is a town of yuppies. And not everybody's a yuppie. We don't use that word anymore. I don't know what it even means. I don't know what we are now, but there was a sense of things. So this culture, the culture of Edwardsville, has this sort of context. And if we're going to reach people, we have to understand that and be reaching them that way. Nothing wrong with that in some way. It's just understanding culture, where we live, the environment we're in, shapes who we're becoming. If you've been overseas, or spent time overseas, you may be aware that Americans have a certain what's what I'm looking for, reputation in certain countries. And as someone who grew up in a different country, I can tell you that in growing up as a kid, we could always spot the Americans. Not just because we heard them speak English. It's what they wore, how they carried themselves, like they'd wear. And in case of growing up in Argentina, in Argentina, when we grew up there, men don't wear shorts in town. Like if you're going to be about town, you're in pants, not even jeans, in pants. So you go downtown shopping and you see some guy in shorts and tennis shoes, and kind of loud, like, oh, I don't have to hear him talk. He's an American. The environment that we're in, the culture that you live in, shapes you. For better or for worse, it's shaping us. When I was in college, I went from Buenos Aires, Argentina to Shawnee, Oklahoma. It was like I could ride subways and buses all day long to a place that didn't have a car. There were no buses. It was like I'm stuck on this campus. I lived in Oklahoma for a period of years. I don't remember exactly how many, 6 or 7. By the time I left, so to tell you this, sort of years into that, I went to my brother's wedding, and we saw a film of this, also a video, several years back, of his, of his reception, the reception. And so there was somebody, halfway through the video, somebody starts talking that's not in camera view, and we're listening, and the camera pans, and it's me. And none of us knew it was me. Because I had Oklahoma drawl down so well, I didn't even know I was doing it. I had my Resistol brown cowboy hat. I had my Tony Lama boots. That was me for several years. It's hard to believe, isn't it? I look back, I don't even know how to do Oklahoman anymore. I actually saw my hat in the basement the other day. The environment you live in wants to shape you into its image. There was nothing wrong with that. I enjoyed it. It was part of the culture I lived in. I don't remember choosing to absorb that. I just know that I look back and say somewhere along the line, I chose a different dialect, different language, it was good people, good fun. The environment that we're in shapes us all at this day. We become like the place we call home. The point is this. All these factors have a synergistic effect. Taken together, they naturally work in such a way that shapes us into the specific kind of person that we become, whether we realize it or not. It's the human experience, whether we're realizing it or not. And it all takes time. It's slow and steady, influencing, forming, that happens with experiences, good, bad, or indifferent. Along the way, you may get a divorce, get a new job, start a business, and it's successful for a while or begins to grow and be successful. Along the way, you'll lose a loved one. Along the way, somewhere you may discover that your family of origin had so much more than you to impact and shape who you were than you really understood, probably more than any of these other elements. We're all shaped by our experiences, by the stories, by our habits, by our relationships, by the environment that we live in. We're shaped and formed by our experiences, slow and sure over time. Here's the main point, and I'll close. All of this has an effect on us, has an effect on you. It's forming you, and all you have to do, think about this, and all you have to do is wake up tomorrow morning and live like it's just another day. And it will keep forming you. So the question is, for all of us, for you and for me, trying to live as apprentices of Jesus, how do we counter this? And what do we do to not just keep flowing down that river? How do we offset the impact? How do we change to become more like Jesus? I want to pick up there next week with our third goal, understanding what it means to become like Jesus in order to do what Jesus did. Would you pray with me? Father, I marvel at the mystery and complexity of our humanity. I'm grateful that when you chose to take on flesh and become fully human, that you modeled for us what it could look like to live a life, a full life, a fully human life, experiencing all that you designed us to experience, including joy and anger and sorrow and all that comes with living. You shaped us so that the stories that we're a part of shape us and allow us to see and make sense of the world, and that we don't do this alone, that we get to be with people and are shaped by the people that we give ourselves to relationship in. And we're shaped by the way that just things that come, aware or not, that become habits in our lives, and others that we choose, how it all comes together in a certain place with a certain kind of people to shape us into who you designed us to be. I'm grateful that you understood that. And in Jesus, you help us see the priority of putting that on the table and walking through it to understand how do we counter it in such a way that in accepting Jesus' invitations to be his apprentices, we can know with confidence that he is able not simply to live that life, but to teach us how to find it, how to give our lives to it, that we might become like him, that we might do what he did, that your kingdom might come and our lives be fulfilled because of it. Help us see what we need to see, hear what we need to hear. Be willing, most importantly, to do whatever it is you lead us to do in these decisions in this conversation as to what the next right step is. In your name I pray. Amen.